Welcome to our online history class at Downey High School. I'm your instructor, Ms. Lojano, and today we are going to be exploring the question you see posted on your screen. Despite the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, how are the rights of freedmen still restricted in the South? We're going to be focusing on the period of Reconstruction, which, as you can see at the top, is from 1865 to 1877, although we'll include a couple things that come into play in the later time periods. In order to do this, you are going to need page 42 from the workbook. So that is the packet of papers that you picked up from Downey High School. They gave you a big workbook, and you're going to grab page 42 from that workbook. It looks exactly like this on what you see pictured on the left. Or if you have lost that or you never received it, you can use the Google Doc that's posted on Canvas, and you can either split screen with the Edpuzzle, or you could take pictures of the slide and copy it over later. You do want to make sure that you are listening to this lecture, though, not just copying everything down, because you are going to be writing about this as an essay exam at the end of the unit. So it's very important that you understand both the amendments and the restrictions on the rights of freedmen. And I'm going to be taking you through all of that content in just 1 second. So make sure you have in front of you either page 42 or the Google Doc that's posted on Canvas. Okay, before we get into the actual content, I do want to make one background statement about how we typically think about progress. So you can see on the left-hand picture over here, this is how we usually think of progress. Like, we started out with slavery and now we don't have it. Slowly the progress has gotten better. That's not actually what progress typically looks like for most civil rights movements. What we're going to see is something more like what's pictured on the right. So you can see that over time it does get better, right? It used to be legal to own people as property. It is no longer legal to do that. However, as the movements go down, there will essentially be 2 steps forward and then a backlash and 1 step back. So you can see that more in this graph, right? Like forward, back, forward, back. And what we're going to look at today is both the forward step, forward progress, and the pushback in the Civil War era. Okay, so this is the question, as I mentioned, that we're looking at. If we're going to talk about despite the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we need to know what those amendments say. So on page 42, there is not a specific section for you to write this down, but you need to write this down. So I'm going to recommend either turning your paper sideways, and you can use the left margin, or if you turn over to the back, there are boxes that say 13, 14, and 15. You can write in that. If you're typing in the Google Doc, you can just put this at the top. Okay, so let's go through these really quick. This is right after the Civil War is over that we're passing these 3 amendments, and you can use the pictures on the right to help you remember. So 13th Amendment, anybody remember what that's doing? That's right, it abolishes slavery. In fact, it says there will no longer be slavery or involuntary servitude of any kind except upon conviction of a crime. That's actually going to become significant later, but for now, we're just going to put 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. Okay, so again, you're writing this down somewhere. Okay, 14th Amendment, you can see the next picture. That's right, grants freedmen citizenship. Okay, so the 13th frees them from slavery. The 14th Amendment gives them citizenship. Okay, then once you're a citizen, what can you do? That's right, vote. Okay, so the 15th Amendment is going to grant freedmen suffrage. That's our fancy word for voting. So we got 13th, no more slavery. 14th, grants citizenship. 15th, grants the right to vote. Okay, so now I want to look at, we're going to get into the heart of this page that you're using. So we're looking at 5 ways that Southern states are going to push back on the progress that's suggested by those amendments. And you can see those 5 ways are listed. So we have the Black Codes, Jim Crow laws, disenfranchisement, the KKK, and sharecropping. That's what we're going to look at. Where it says number 1, Black Codes, that's what we're going to talk about next. And summary, you're going to go ahead and copy what's on the slide into that section. And then at the end of each of one, I'm going to give you a chance to circle, do you think this is a social, a political, or an economic form of discrimination? You are going to skip the justification, and you're going to skip the blank after social, political, and economic. Okay, so we're just doing the summary and then circling social, political, or economic. If you're doing the Google Doc, you can just highlight social, political, or economic. Okay, so here we go. Number 1 on page 42 is the Black Codes, which were state laws that established a second class of citizenship for freedmen. Okay, and as I mentioned, it may be better for you to, if you want, to listen to this first and then pause it and copy it. That might actually work better. Okay, so the examples that we have of this are like a curfew. So freedmen often were restricted from being out after 10 p.m., even though everyone else was allowed to be out. There were living restrictions on them. So they would say you can't live in this part of the town. And they were also prohibited from owning a gun, which was primarily about them being able to protect themselves from violence, including the KKK, which we will talk about later. Okay, so essentially what this is doing is it's saying, well, yeah, the 14th Amendment makes you a citizen, but there are a bunch of rules that apply to you that don't apply to everybody else, right? And so that is why we call this a second class of citizenship. The other crazy part about these laws is that if you broke one of these, so say you get caught out after curfew and you get arrested, you go to jail, you're going to get a fine for that. And if you can't pay that fine, then they would have an auction and they would hire you out to the highest bidder. Okay, so this could actually result in freedmen going back into another form of slavery as well. Okay, so now once you have this copied, you can pause in just a second. You're going to go ahead and circle, does this sound like social, political, or economic discrimination to you? You're going to go ahead and circle. Remember, social means it's keeping them away from people. Political means you're not able to participate in government. And economic means you're not able to move up in your job. So you're going to choose which one does that sound like to you. You're going to go ahead and circle. Okay, second form of discrimination is called Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws are also state laws that segregated public facilities for quote unquote colored people. And these are laws that you would probably be more familiar with, right? Like we learn about these even in the 60s with Rosa Parks. That picture up there on the top left is a really famous picture of the segregated water fountains. So the most famous areas are probably restaurants, bathrooms, and buses, but this is really all of Southern society that is going to become segregated. These laws actually become most popular in the later 1800s, like 1880s and 90s, but we're talking about them in this period anyway, and they're going to be in place until the 1960s. Okay, so these are not outlawed until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay, now when you think about this, these laws that are segregating public facilities, does that to you sound like a social, a political, or an economic form of discrimination? So having to do with people, with the government, or with money. You're going to go ahead and circle that onto the page. And now let's talk about the third form of discrimination, which is called disenfranchisement. So disenfranchisement is a big word that just means to keep people from exercising their rights. And in this case, we're talking specifically about the right to vote. Okay, so that's what disenfranchisement means. It's to keep people from exercising the right to vote. And there are several ways that Southern states were able to do this. So I should preface this by saying that at the beginning of Reconstruction, there were some freedmen who were able to vote. And in fact, the first 2 Black senators are elected during this period. You're going to have some Black congressmen elected into the legislature. Okay, however, eventually the South sort of catches up. Southern states get wise to this, and they create a system to prevent them from continuing to vote. And that system is going to be very effective all the way through to the 1960s. Okay, so that is, you can see over here, the SpongeBob picture. Just kidding, right? They're like, yeah, you got to vote. No, not anymore. And there are several ways in which this happened. We are going to talk about 3. So the first way is that Southern states issued poll taxes or requirements for a poll tax. A poll tax means you have to pay money to vote. And the problem with this is that freedmen don't have money because they were just released from slavery. It's not like they have these big savings accounts that they can dig into in order to vote. Now, what I do want you to notice about all of these voting restrictions is that none of them are specifically racist. Okay, so it's not like they're saying, hey, freedmen, don't vote. Okay, but what they're doing is they're creating rules that are on the surface equitable, but will result in freedmen not voting. Right? That's how they're able to get these rules passed. So that is the first one, the poll tax. You have to pay money to vote. Second rule is they established something called the literacy test, where you have to pass a test to prove you can read before you can vote. Okay, so this is definitely a moment I would recommend listening and then pausing in a second. Okay, so literacy, remember that means that you can read. And this is actually a fairly logical argument, right? If somebody told you, hey, I think people should have to read in order to vote, it kind of makes sense, right? Like, I need to be able to read the ballot. I need to know what I'm talking about in order to choose what I'm voting for on the ballot. Okay, so it sounds rational. Okay, the problem though is that this test is not actually testing if you can read. The questions are crazy difficult. Very few people can pass this test, even people who have studied. So most of the questions come out of the Constitution. They're questions like, how big is the size of Washington, D.C.? How long is money allocated for the armed forces, right? Like, these are questions that average Americans don't know. Most people would fail this test. Okay, so although it's on the surface, quote unquote, a literacy test, the point is that you will fail it, which will prevent you from voting. And you can see over here on the right, that's the F, right? Everybody who takes this test is going to fail. Okay, the problem is white people take this test, they're going to fail too. Right? So we got to figure out a way that they can be exceptions so they don't have to take the test, right? Because they have to keep voting. So what they come up with is called the grandfather clause. And the grandfather clause allows white people to not take the literacy test if they or their grandfathers voted in a previous election. Okay, now I want to point out it doesn't actually say white people. Okay, so it says anybody who has voted in the 1866-67 election or any prior election, and that could be anyone, their father or their grandfather, they do not have to take the literacy test. Okay, so let's think about this for a second. How come 0 freedmen would have voted in the 1866 and 67 election? Okay, if you answered because they were enslaved and therefore property and could not vote, you are correct, right? And none of their grandfathers would have voted either because they were also enslaved and not allowed to vote. Okay, so what this does is it makes an exception so that white people can get around the literacy test, right? That's what we're doing. So they can keep voting and freedmen cannot. Okay, so this is what we know. You're seeing that popping up. Freedmen were enslaved at the time. Obviously, that means they didn't vote. So they're not, the grandfather clause will not apply to them. Okay, this is the part that gets extra crazy. If you can't vote, you can't serve on a jury because jury selection comes from voter registration. So what that means is if we prevent freedmen from voting, they can never serve on juries. So every Black man who is accused, or woman, right, they're accused of a crime in the South, they are going to have all white juries every time, right? Because there are no freedmen voting. So they're not going to be on juries. Okay, now, what I need you to think about next is, does this sound like a social, political, or economic form of discrimination? Is it stopping people from being together? Is it stopping them from participating in the government? Or is it stopping them from getting better jobs? You're going to go ahead and circle which one you think it is. All right, number 4, this is probably the most familiar to you, is the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, which forms in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. The original purpose was to keep freedmen from voting and actually using the political process. So they're going to use violence and intimidation to restrict Black rights. I'm sure some of this is very familiar to you, right? So you can see in the picture, there's the white outfits. That's pretty familiar. Also, like the burning crosses and lynching people. Okay, but part of the purpose of the lynching is actually to keep people from voting, and it's to terrorize any Black people who are able to make it into government. So they're attempting to circumvent their ability to participate in the government. Eventually, the KKK will also target people for crossing boundaries of social etiquette, right? So, like if a white person and a Black person are hanging out together or shaking hands or doing things that they're not socially allowed to do if they're dating, right? Then they might go and lynch someone as well. So they're going to use that violence and intimidation to keep them out of government and to keep them from socializing with other white people. Okay, so when we look at this one, you could actually circle a couple of these options. Does this sound like the KKK's impact on freedmen rights has to do with social, political, or economic discrimination? I'm going to go ahead and circle that. And that brings us to our last form of discrimination, which is called sharecropping. Sharecropping creates a new form of slavery, which we refer to as debt slavery. And this section actually has the most information in it so that I can explain it well, with the exception of disenfranchisement. There's not a ton of room right there, so you may need to kind of, I don't know how you want to fit this in, but you're going to need to fit quite a bit of writing. So, and the other thing I would recommend is maybe waiting until the end. So here we go to write everything down. So here we go. This is the situation. Former slave masters still need help with their crops. Okay, so Civil War ends. All the slaves are freed. I'm a plantation owner and I grow cotton. I have no help, right? I'm like, who's going to pick the cotton? Surely not me. Okay, so that's the situation that we're in. Former slave masters are like, who's going to pick my crops? Freedmen have nowhere to go. Because really, we freed them. We're like, hey, go into the world without an education, right? It was previously illegal to teach freedmen to read. So they can't read. They don't have savings. They don't have schooling, right? They're like, where am I going to go? Okay, so what ends up happening is the slave masters, or the former slave master, is going to offer a contract to the freedmen. Like, hey, work for me and I'll provide your housing and we can split the crops 50-50. Okay, so on the plantation, they'll go and they'll like build a little house, right, for the freedmen. They're like, here, you can live here with your family. And then you farm for me. And at the end of the year, you keep half the money and I keep half the money, hence share cropping, right? We're sharing the crops. Okay, so that's the contract. Okay, so here's the problem. We get to the end of the year. And by the way, this contract could be any number of ways. 50-50 is a frequent form that they use, but it could be laid out in any number of ways. Okay, so say we get to the end of the year and 50% is not enough, right? I'm like, I have 5 kids and I can't feed all of them on only 50%. So I go to my former slave master and I'm like, look, this isn't enough for me. How about I owe you the rest next year? And he says, no problem. You can owe me next year. And now the contract, instead of 50-50, becomes 40-60, right? Only 40% of the money comes to me. So I get to the end of the year, and if I couldn't make it on 50%, I surely can't make it on 40. And so I go back to my former slave master and I say, look, 40% isn't enough. Is there something we can do? And he's like, no problem. You can owe me next year. Okay, so my new contract is 20-80, right? And it only takes a couple of years before the new contract is 0-100, right? And I am essentially in debt slavery. No longer do I get to keep any of this money. Okay, now you add on top of this that Black codes required 1-year labor contracts and made it illegal to run from those contracts. They also allowed employers to beat employees. Okay, so what that means is I'm not allowed to run from this debt that I owe. If I do run, I go to jail and then I can be hired out to someone, and that's another form of slavery. And my employer is allowed to beat me, right? So essentially, this is slavery round 2, debt slavery. That's what it is. Okay, so the South has essentially figured out a way to recreate the system that they had before. And the last thing that you need to do for this is determine, does this sound to you like social, political, or economic discrimination? You're going to go ahead and circle the one that you think it is. If you need to pause to finish copying down the slide, you're welcome to do that. Thank you so much for sticking with us in our lecture about Southern restrictions on freedmen. Have a great day, guys.